Howdy, howdy. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you my reusable learning object, and the concept I chose to address is unanticipated consequences of innovation. For an introduction to the concept, like I said, in this reusable learning object, otherwise known as an RLO, I will be discussing the unanticipated consequences of innovation. So what are unanticipated consequences? Unanticipated consequences are changes due to an innovation that are neither intended nor recognized. These changes are not readily apparent when first introduced to a social system. Even change agents cannot see unanticipated consequences until widespread adoption has occurred. So these are things that people do not know before releasing their innovation into whoever they want to share it with, into the social system. And they can be good or bad, but I think it's really important for us to understand what these are. So how this RLO works, a reusable learning object is a short, self-contained digital learning activity or tool that is often stored in a central online repository. So my RLO is all stored here. There are 2 pages to it. This is the first page kind of explaining how it works and how you are going to use it to help educate others. But included in it is an informational video and an activity. The link to the video is at the bottom of this graphic right here. You can kind of see it here. If you highlight that link, it should take you right over to the video. The learning objective and purpose of my RLO. The purpose of this RLO is to provide an effective learning tool which can be used to educate individuals about unanticipated consequences of innovation. The single learning objective is students or participants, whoever you are educating, will understand how the unanticipated consequences of an innovation can cause unforeseen impacts on a social system. So the actions we're going to take to help reach this learning objective, like I said, we're trying to educate. So the video that I have provided is a TED Talk video. It is a presentation by a man named Edward Kenner, and he is talking about unintended and unanticipated consequences of some innovations. He provides some examples. I think it's an excellent education tool. There's also a provided activity, which I have decided to be a think, pair, share activity. So whenever you are using this RLO, you will have your people get into pairs. They will answer the prompts that are on the think, pair, share activity, just to help them brainstorm and to think of examples from their own lives to help them grasp the concept of what unanticipated consequences are and how they impact the social system in which the innovation is introduced to. The expected outcome of this RLO in a formal way of saying it is individuals who have access to this RLO will be able to guide others and educate them on the effects of unanticipated consequences of a social system. With that being said, we are going to watch the video that I have provided for you on unintended, or otherwise known as unanticipated, consequences.
And I'd like to review just how unintended consequences play the part that they do. Let's go to 40,000 years before the present, to the time of the cultural explosion, when music, art, technology, so many of the things that we're enjoying today, so many of the things that are being demonstrated at TED were born. And the anthropologist Randall White has made a very interesting observation, that if our ancestors 40,000 years ago had been able to see what they had done, they wouldn't have really understood it. They were responding to immediate concerns. They were making it possible for us to do what they do, and yet they didn't really understand how they did it. Now let's advance to 10,000 years before the present. And this is when it really gets interesting. What about the domestication of grains? What about the origins of agriculture? What would our ancestors 10,000 years ago have said if they really had technology assessment. And I can just imagine the committees reporting back to them on where agriculture was going to take humanity, at least in the next few hundred years. It was really bad news. First of all, worse nutrition, maybe shorter lifespans. It was simply awful for women. The skeletal remains from that period have shown that they were grinding grain morning, noon, and night. And politically, it was awful. It was the beginning of a much higher degree of inequality among people. If there had been rational technology assessment then, I think they very well might have said, let's call the whole thing off. Even now, our choices are having unintended effects. Historically, for example, chopsticks, according to one Japanese anthropologist who wrote a dissertation about it at the University of Michigan, resulted in long-term changes in the dentition, in the teeth of the Japanese public. And we are also changing our teeth right now. There is evidence that the human mouth and teeth are growing smaller all the time. That's not necessarily a bad unintended consequences, but I think from the point of view of a Neanderthal, there would have been a lot of disapproval of the wimpish choppers that we now have. So these things are kind of relative to where you or your ancestors happen to stand. In the ancient world, there was a lot of respect for unintended consequences. There was a very healthy sense of caution reflected in the tree of knowledge, in Pandora's box, and especially in the myth of Prometheus that's been so important in recent metaphors about technology. And that's all very true. The physicians of the ancient world, especially the Egyptians who started medicine as we know it, were very conscious of what they could and couldn't treat. And the translations of the surviving texts say, this I will not treat, this I cannot treat. They were very conscious. So were the followers of Hippocrates. The Hippocratic manuscripts also repeatedly, according to recent studies, show how important it is not to do harm. More recently, Harvey Cushing, who really developed neurosurgery as we know it, who changed it from a field of medicine that had a majority of deaths resulting from surgery to one in which there was a hopeful outlook, he was very conscious that he was not always going to do the right thing, but he did his best and he kept meticulous records that let him transform that branch of medicine. Now, if we look forward a bit to the 19th century, we find a new style of technology. What we find is no longer simple tools, but systems. We find more and more complex arrangements of machines that make it harder and harder to diagnose what's going on. And the first people who saw that were the telegraphers of the mid-19th century, who were the original hackers. Thomas Edison would have been very, very comfortable in the atmosphere of a software firm today. And these hackers had a word for those mysterious bugs in telegraph systems that they called bugs. That was the origin of the word bug. This consciousness, though, was a little slow to seep through the general population, even people who were very, very well informed. Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, was a big investor in the most complex machine of all times, at least until 1918, registered with the US Patent Office. That was the Page typesetter. The Page typesetter had 18,000 parts. The patent had 64 pages of text and 271 figures. It was such a beautiful machine because it did everything that a human being did in setting type, including returning the type to its place, which was a very difficult thing. And Mark Twain, who knew all about typesetting, really was smitten by this machine. Unfortunately, he was smitten in more ways than one because it made him bankrupt, and he had to tour the world speaking to recoup his money. And this was an important thing about 19th century technology, that all these relationships among parts could make the most brilliant idea fall apart even when judged by the most expert people. Now, there was something else, though, in the early 20th century that made things even more complicated. And that was that safety technology itself could be a source of danger. The lesson of the Titanic for a lot of the contemporaries was that you must have enough lifeboats for everyone on the ship. And this was the result of the tragic loss of lives of people who could not get into them. However, there was another case, the Eastland, a ship that capsized in Chicago Harbor in 1915, and it killed 841 people. That was 14 more than the passenger toll of the Titanic. The reason for it, in part, was the extra lifeboats that were added that made this already unstable ship even more unstable. And that again proves that when you're talking about unintended consequences, it's not that easy to know the right lessons to draw. It's really a question of the system.
I think that last example that he gave of the Eastland ship is a fantastic example of unanticipated consequences. They were almost overcompensating for what happened on the Titanic, and they wanted to make sure, this is not going to happen to our ship. And they put extra lifeboats on there, and because of that, it made the ship uneasy and weighted down, and that's in turn what ended up sinking the ship, which had an impact on a social system, a whole social system. Like he said, there was over 800 lives lost there. So that was unfortunate, but that's a great example of an unanticipated or unintended consequence. Moving on to our learning activity, we have, like I mentioned, the think, pair, share. So your participants will get into pairs and partners, and they will think of these questions that I have come up with to help advance their knowledge and to get their brains thinking on some unanticipated consequences. So the first question is that they are going to think about an innovation. And in this first blank, they will write down what innovation they will be discussing. The second question is, what do you think was the expected outcome of this innovation? So what was it intended to do? What was the innovation intended to be? For that ship example, that innovation was intended to bring a leisurely vacation to people. And in turn, that's not what ended up happening. But what is the unanticipated consequences of this innovation is the next blank, and they will fill that out. And then lastly, the last part of this think pair is share. So what are we going to share? We're going to share to the group, whoever you are working with, how the unanticipated consequences affect the social system the innovation was introduced to. So what is the lasting effect it has caused? A good example I think of is the internet. So we have this wonderful tool in our hands. We have the internet, but an unanticipated consequence of this can be cyberbullying. And cyberbullying greatly affects the social system of young kids and teenagers in high school. So that's just an example that you could give if you wanted to provide an example for questions. I hope that this RLO can aid you in the education of unanticipated consequences. And I thank you for your time, and I thank you for listening to my presentation.